Okay, welcome to Guitar Knobs, the guitars, gear, noise, and nonsense podcast. Hosted today by this knob, me, Todd Novak, and our honorary knob, our special guest, Dave Harris. Dave, how you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing great.
Excellent. We have a two-part treat. Dave is a renowned local amp builder, and he's got a pretty special story to share with us, and we've got a lot of good questions for him. But before we get into that, we need to hear what this thing can do. So, Marc, why don't you give us a shot? This is Marc DiCenzo.
Hello.
He runs Circa Studios here, and this is a pretty amazing recording facility. And he was kind enough to let us come in today and hear this amazing amp.
My pleasure.
And play some amazing guitar. All right, so that's just a little tiny taste of what the amp that we're going to be talking about, and more specifically the amp builder. But there's a Marc, why don't you tell us what you're running right now?
Well, I'm running a G&L ASAT Classic Telly made in the last 5 years, and that's going directly into the TAF 30R. And
That's the amp.
That's the amplifier. And that's going into a Marshall cab, 1966A 212 cab with a pair of G12H greenback speakers, 30 watts apiece each at 16 ohms with 30 watt amp.
And that's what we'd classify that. That's just a little bit bigger than maybe, I guess you could say a lunchbox, but it's certainly a micro cab.
Yeah, it is not a large cab. It's if you were to take
about as big as a shoebox. Just so you know, being here in the room, hearing this amp live is pretty special. And just to touch on why we're even doing this. Marc and I do some work together. We do some fun together, some music stuff. And one day we were here at the studio, and I saw this really ragtag looking tiny amp. I mean, it was definitely a shoebox. It looked like a school project in the kindest way I can say that. And I said, "What is this thing?" And he says, "Hey man, you got to hear this." So we plugged it in, and I was truly blown away. He said that the guy who made this is currently setting him up with another one. And you know, I've heard a lot of amps, and I said, wow, this is really special. So I want to know what was the story behind it. And as Marc started telling me a little bit more, I said, this is pretty interesting. Let's have a chat with this guy. And, you know, we are located in Columbus, Ohio, and anything, you know, anywhere you're at listening, anything that's coming out of your hometown is always kind of special. And we want to make sure that we're giving attention to those who deserve it. That said, Marc, what pedals are you running?
I am not running any pedals at all.
Wait a minute. Do you mean to tell me that there were no pedals on that?
No pedals.
So you're just, all those tones you got out of there, you were just volume?
Just volume, just the volume in a tone pot on the Telecaster that I was playing, and that's all I was using to vary up my sound. I switched actually from the out of phase position to the bridge position for overdrive, started in the out of phase position and clean, and switched to bridge. And I think the sound reflected that. That's the one great thing about this amp, among the many great things. But one of the great things is that the sound of the amp reflects what I'm doing with the guitar.
What go through your settings on the amp really quick.
Right now, I've got the volume at 7.5. I've got the treble around 4, and the bass at around 2.5, which I like for its overdrive channel. I can play, for example, I'll turn the operator back on. And that's setting I like for clean is just everything at noon, bass, treble, and volume. If I were to throw that into the fat or overdrive channel, it's a little bit more than I usually go for on the bottom end. So I generally dial back a little on the treble and on the bass, get a little bit more of that mid-range, and push it up about 7 is... And you can, it's more than enough overdrive, nice. And that's not even dime. That's just at 7, and it goes on from there. But that's all I usually need if I want to do heavy metal. I'll just put a little pedal in front of it. But
yeah, and I think it's fair to say that we purposely didn't drag in multi-$1,000 guitars to do these little demos. It's worth saying that with really affordable gear, the sounds that you can come up with are truly incredible. So we're going to dive back into. We also have an Epiphone Sheraton 2, and so we just try to bring the range of what does a classic humbucker sound like, what does a tele sound like, and what does a semi-hollow sound like on this amp, and run through all the different varieties. It's an incredibly dynamic amp, and the real reason we're doing this is to talk to the person who created this thing. So back to Dave Harris. Dave, you still with us?
Oh yeah.
I don't mean in that celestial way. I just mean so okay, with something that is handcrafted. Just touch really quick without going into super deep detail yet. How are these brought to life? Anything special about that?
Well, I think one of the things that's special about them is I was building amplifiers originally in 1956, 1957, and these are very similar to the designs that were being brought out by Fender, and in fact Bell Sound Laboratories was here in Columbus, and they used a lot of the same circuitry, the same basic concept that I do in my amps. And that older method was not as efficient power-wise, but the sound that it made was superior. Mm-hmm. And that's what I heard. And so I wanted to go back to that old sound when I started making amplifiers. Mm-hmm. And I used those old design concepts, and I got an amplifier that sounds like I want it to sound.
Good. And you have, I think, a buzzword maybe in the guitar industry, certainly right now, is point-to-point wiring.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about...
Well, point-to-point wiring was the classic way to build amplifiers in the 50s, and in fact it stretched back before that. And a good designer would sit down with his schematic, and he would look at the components that were going to be wired together and try to arrange them in such a fashion that everything would go from a point on a tube socket to another point on a tube socket, and you didn't need to use many terminal strips, and you didn't need to use any kind of a turret board or anything of that nature. You could actually put the components right in where they go in the circuit, and it takes a while to figure that out. And in my case, I built about 5 of them before I decided on the layout that I was going to use. And with that layout, our leads are short. There's very little coupling between components, so you are less apt to get sporadic oscillations and noise. And all in all, it's a wonderful way to build a circuit if you've got the time. It is time consuming.
Yeah. So time consuming. If I send you an order today, what does that look like?
Well, the electronics that goes into this will typically take 8 to 12 hours to wire. And, of course, I do the whole thing. I'm also making...
That sounds really fast. I don't know about you guys.
It is. The first ones weren't that fast. You get down into a procedure, and you know what you're going to do next, and you have everything all lined up. You can build them in about 12 hours. Wow. But that's just the electronics. And, of course, in my case, I'm also building the cabinet, and I'm actually buying flat plate aluminum and bending it and drilling it and punching it, and so
wow.
There's a lot of hours in it.
Yeah,
I often say I work for the same wages as a Chinese schoolgirl, but I want to compete with China, and I want our people in the United States to realize that we can make amplifiers that will offer superior sound. And they're affordable. They're affordable for the students that are beginning to discover the beauty in the guitar, all the wonderful things that can be done with it. And if you have a little solid-state amp, and you're just not going to hear that.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
That's definitely fair to say. I mean, just based on what we heard, the dynamic range, most people would spend, a couple $1,000s on just pedals alone trying to get some of those tones. So the fact that is all coming out of one very small, very affordable, very dynamic amp is really special. So we're going to spend a little bit of time trying to figure out how we got here, how you got here, and I guess collectively, because we get to experience your work. So take us back to the Wayback Machine, and how did you start?
Well, I got a jigsaw for Christmas and made myself a wonderful little slingshot. And when my father came home from work...
What year is this? What year is this?
This would have been 1954.
Okay.
About 1954. My dad came home from work, and it was very late, because he had been experimenting with photography, taking pictures of the interior of eyes. And lo and behold, when I showed
eyeballs, right?
Yeah, the inside of the eyeball.
That's weird.
And well, it's very helpful for the eye surgeons. And in this case, a youngster had taken a BB shot in the eye from a slingshot. And so when I showed Dad my new slingshot, he looked and smiled, and he says, I'm not going to ask you not to play with it, but I want you to wait until tomorrow night. I'm going to bring something home. And so I did, and he brought home a kit for a crystal radio.
So what's a crystal radio?
Just a crystal radio is the radio technology that evolved in about World War I, where people would take a galena, which is a lead ore, and put a cat's whisker on it, a very tiny wire would come down and make contact on it. And in fact, we didn't know it yet, but this was the forerunner of what would later become our transistors, because this was a semiconductor.
Oh, wow.
And with this device, fellows would wind a big coil, tune it to a radio frequency, and then put an antenna on it, and then rectify that signal, turn the AC from the radio wave into audio. And it was an extremely simple device, but anyhow, my dad and I worked until about 1 in the morning, and in those days, all the local radio stations signed off at midnight. So I was afraid maybe it wasn't working, and I began to listen, and then finally I heard a very faint voice, and it said, "This is WWL, New Orleans, the voice of the Deep South." And that really impressed me. To hear that radio signal coming all the way from New Orleans with no power, nothing hooked up to the power line at all, no battery, just earphones and this little piece of crystal. It's amazing.
That's amazing.
It is amazing, and still is amazing to me. But so Dad and I both got very interested in radio.
Yeah.
And that's how it happened that a few years later, having built ham radio transmitters and receivers, Dad was playing his new Les Paul. That was in '57, I believe.
Wow.
Okay.
Well,
Yes, I still have
that,
it.
Huh? Oh, you still have it?
Oh, I still have it, yes.
Holy moly.
Great sounding amp. I'm just noodling here. So with the semi-hollow body guitar, it can turn it up just a little bit with the
good
crunch,
jangly.
and I can get it. Can't complain about that. Give it a little bit more bump, and you can. Epiphone Sheridan. You can just. So there's not a lot you can't do with relatively inexpensive instruments and a really, really, really good guitar amp. Can't sing its praises high enough. Anyways.
It's worth mentioning, it's not going to come through on your in-ear speakers probably quite as much or in the car or whatever, but the range and the clarity that we're hearing in this room, Marc actually has a so the cabinet that he has is, he took the casters off, so it's sitting on a carpet. There's also a box behind it with a weight on the box, because some of these sounds that he's getting out of here, especially when he's really pushing it for demo purposes, we're actually getting movement on the cabinet. Isn't that correct?
Well, yes, that is correct. It just shakes it across the floor. I have about a 40-pound wood block with 70 pounds of dumbbells on it, sitting on some polyurethane tiles that I got from a hardware store that's used in plumbing, just so it doesn't slide. And I had to tighten everything down on it because this is a very strong 30 watts, and it's 30 watts clean, right?
Yeah, that's 30 watts of pure sine wave, and with no distortion detected in the waveform. I'm sure there's some, but it's not detectable visibly. It actually puts out probably closer to 60 watts distorted, and that's when you're going to start moving your box across the floor.
Yes, and it's the G12Hs are I think 13 pounds a piece. Yep. So that cabinet is probably, without the weights, I'm going to say somewhere in that 30 to 40 pounds. So it's throwing a lot of energy, and I had it going through a 50-watt speaker before I had this cabinet, and this amp was way too much for it, and I was afraid I was going to blow it, so that's why I opted for a heavier duty cabinet, and it's still more throttle than I need.
So it's fair to say, though it looks pretty small, and I think this is something that we're seeing a major trend in right now in the guitar industry, or music industry, that you don't need a massive rig to gig with. I mean, this would be more than enough at a live gig. I think it's also worth mentioning that when we're talking about this amp in particular, this is a 30-watt amp. So like
Yes.
you are also making 10-watt amps.
Right.
And
I see I have a 10-watt, which is a pair of 6AQ5 tubes, which is similar to the 6V6. And then there's a 14-watt, and that's with a pair of 6V6s. Mm-hmm. Then the Quad EL84 is a 30-watt. This is what we're listening to here. And then the 35-watt is a pair of classic 6L6s. Mm. And I also have a 100-watt, the Centurion. Only for outdoors, guys.
Don't try this at home. Is that
it's
we're
incredibly
in a large
loud.
room right now, and 100 watts compresses. It makes a big room sound small.
Yeah.
And I do have an attenuator. I was curious about how having 4 broadcast mics and loud guitar amp would come across. And so I do have an attenuator that so I can play this through a 30-watt speaker at lower levels. And I do know that Dave has sold amps that are being used through direct boxes to PA systems. Mm-hmm. And, Dave, we were talking a while ago about the long tail design on the output. I really love how this guitar amplifier translates my performance, and sometimes when I'm playing poorly, maybe a little too accurately. But it is the most honest guitar amp I've ever played. Could you tell us a little about that?
Well, I think that does stem from the fact that it's an old design. Well, a lot of people would say an obsolete design. Back in the late 50s, people began to discover the long tail pair, which was a way of taking your output stage and making it a true differential amplifier. Now, as long as you're within the range of the amp and you haven't saturated any of the stages involved, any of the tubes involved, the long tail pair is capable of producing gain in the output stage, multiplying the input signal by 15, 20 times, which gets you more power out. But the minute any of the sections in there begin to distort, it's a non-symmetrical distortion. And it isn't really very musical. It doesn't sound pleasant. It's harsh. It's like a train wreck. But there are people that like that sound. And if you want that kind of tension, you can get some of it with this. But even when this amplifier breaks up with its cathodiene drive, it's symmetrical. And as a result, it sounds more musical.
It's
that's my best explanation.
My last guitar amp, which I loved and still love, was a 64 blackface Fender Bassman, all original. And the performance, albeit different, this amp, which is way more affordable than that one, I don't miss anything about the performance of that amplifier. In fact, I actually have a little bit more range because the Bassman is a very simple amplifier to play through. And as is this one, this is just as good in every way than that as that amp was. So,
yeah. Well, and you don't have to. I mean, it's a 2-piece, so you don't have to, get a buddy to help you out with everything.
And that's the great thing about having it in a studio setting is that I can play it through. I've got a pair of vintage Jensen speakers that I can play it through. I have a pair of Celestion 75-watt speakers that are right now out of this cabinet that has a little bit more of a mid-swept or a tighter feel on the low end and less mid-range. I like the greenbacks paired with this. It makes me feel like I'm playing either like a, sort of an AC30 or maybe sort of that Blues Breaker Marshall sound, depending on how I'm playing it. I have a Mesa Boogie cabinet that has a different sound, and that's what I like doing. Is as far as I'm aware, amplifiers don't make any sound without speakers, and you change the speakers. It's like having as many amplifiers, and certainly you have to pay attention to the output impedance of the amplifier and the impedance of the speakers. But, every speaker I have has got it written on it. So the amplifier is adjustable, which my Fender amplifiers were not. Yeah. And that's also really cool because I don't have to hunt down exotic speaker wattage and impedance. I can just match the amp to it, which is great. And so, I have a 2-piece, and I prefer it that way, actually.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the speakers. Dave, could you tell us just a little bit about how you go about, like, when you're building a new amp for someone, does the cabinet that they're using play into how you would custom build something, or do you recommend a specific speaker setup? Can you talk about that?
I always like to talk to somebody that is going to use one of my amplifiers about their cabinet design and what sort of venues they want to play in. The speaker is an extremely important part of the system. And as Mark said, each one has their own personality. So if you're looking for lots of clean headroom and a classic jazz style, you would prefer one sort. And if you're playing to a large audience, you probably want to close the back off, for instance. I'm finding also that there's merit in arranging your speakers rather than the usual side-by-side. If you run them vertically, especially if you can get a quad out there, you're creating a wedge of sound that goes out and doesn't do much up and down. And as a result of that, there are fewer dead places in the audience, and everybody can hear you more clearly through your whole range. And then the speakers themselves, the range of speakers that people call guitar speakers is amazing. And one of the things I always look at is the efficiency of the speaker. Because if I go out and I buy a full-range guitar speaker and it says, well, and my sensitivity is 94 decibels for 1 watt at 1 meter. Okay. Now I look at, Classic 30 from Celestion, 101 decibels for 1 watt at 1 meter. Now, I've effectively multiplied my power by 3. Every time you double your power, you only gain 3 decibels. Yeah. So, here's a 30-watt amplifier, and if I play it in that amplifier into that speaker that's a 94 decibel speaker, it's going to sound like about a 5-watt amplifier.
Wow.
Maybe clean, but it sure won't be loud. Mm-hmm. So I think it's important for the guitarist that's selecting a speaker to know, first of all, where most of his sound is going to be. If he has a lot of brightness and he needs a lot of clarity in the upper ranges, he wants a speaker that can handle wider range. He always wants to get efficiency, I think. Solid-state amplifiers did spoil us in that regard because, you want 200 watts, you want 400 watts, no problem. We can give it to you. And so your speaker doesn't have to be as efficient. But I would rather the amplifier do its job and the speaker does its job and we not try to trade off there.
Yeah. And I found I'm doing mostly studio applications, so 30 watts is more than enough, and in fact sometimes is too much depending on what microphone I want to use and what kind of combination of room and attitude that I'm trying to convey in my production. On stage, however, I find in my live performance days that there was always this back and forth with the sound engineer controlling the mix, the live sound engineer. Everybody's asking for more vocals on stage or more drum or kick and snare on stage, and it's because the guitar amps are way too loud, and they don't need to be if they're being mic'd through a PA system that's much louder than anybody should really have a guitar amp. I mean, I'm sure there's some situations out there for guitar players that are listening where more than 30 watts might be necessary, but when you've got 3 bass amp that's pushing 300 watts, and then 2 guitar amps, and you're trying to listen through a wedge that only handles between 100 and 300 watts. Gosh, you don't want to hear 300 watts in your face versus those amplifiers. I always preferred a quieter stage sound. And if you have the right speaker combination and the right amp, you'll get your sound. You'll just be able to hear everybody around you too, and everybody out in the audience can be heard, can hear you better than if your guitar amp was really loud on stage. I'll say from firsthand experience, live mix engineers tend to favor more controllable amps so they can give your band the best sound. That's my 10 cents.
Speaking of sound, we're going to do one more quick demo. You got the telly in hand right now.
Yeah.
Why don't you show us a little bit, something that what this stuff sounds like, and then we'll get back to Dave. Nice. Well, that'll do it.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's all just tone and volume control, and just Mark flipping around on the pickup selector on the telly.
Yeah, just skill.
Yeah, he hasn't touched the amp. Just so what you heard right before that little bloop, 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 like nothing, just straight at it, tone and volume. That's amazing. So let's get back to where you started, where you ended up. Back to your story. I was intrigued about your military experience and getting an electrical engineering education. I think you mentioned.
Well, I got a lot of technical school,
right,
from the Air Force, and it was helpful to put some math behind some of the principles that I was working with before and didn't really understand the relationship. I had a feel for the relationship, but not. I couldn't calculate it. It wasn't very professional.
Do you think that really helped to influence your? So you mentioned when you got out, everybody was running solid state, and that's another curious topic. I don't know that we have time to go into that, but I'm where and why that happened.
Well, power components for audio at the level of starting out at about 35 watts, 35 watts, and going on up to a couple of hundred, they get very expensive, and the equipment gets heavy. The power transformers alone can really weigh you down. At a 100-watt amplifier, you pick one up, it's going to take 2 of me to carry it nowadays. So when solid state came out, this allowed us to work with low voltage, high current, and a couple more directly to the speaker, simplifying the design tremendously. But of course, there's a difference in the sound, and that's something that it's taken the musicians a few years to discover. And everyone's back on the right page today. There's very few people will argue with you that the solid state sounds better. But
to clarify, very few people would argue that a solid state does sound better, when in fact we're in favor of the tubes. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and in fact, if you want to be scientific about it and analyze what's going on, a solid state amp can produce a lot less distortion, a much purer sound, true high fidelity. But our ears are not listening for true high fidelity. We're listening for the interplay when the distortion begins to happen, as it gives a personality, an organic sound to the voice. And that's an analog thing.
Yeah.
And so it's not just on or off, which is where your solid state basically works. It's just on or off.
That's really interesting. I will reference a podcast we just did where we talked about, so you're bringing the scientific aspect of that, and we were talking about sort of the guitar aspect of that the other day, where it is, and nothing against like Joe Satriani or anything, but I find, as Joe Satriani sound to me sounds like what a solid state amp sounds like to you. We rattled off a whole bunch of other guitar players that weren't in the same super echelon because of the fact that there was that the mistake of nature kind of working its way in there. You're hearing things that aren't pure, that aren't 100%. Unadulterated. There's accidental noise that's happening. So that it's curious that you brought that up from an amplifier and a scientific standpoint, and we were talking about that just from playing.
Yeah.
So you can imagine if you start mixing those combos around, that greatly affects your sound.
Yeah.
So coming out of there with new learnings, would you say that influenced where you are building like up to this point?
Well, it certainly has encouraged me to realize that what I'm doing is on the right track to giving people the sounds and the versatility of sounds that they want with a guitar amplifier. And so I'm reluctant to make changes. However, I have had a group of people that are saying, I want an amplifier that breaks up a lot more like a Marshall. And to that end, I have built an amplifier family up that I rate with its pure sound output, and I also rate it with its overdrive output. And we have a 6V6 model and a 6L6 model. The 6L6 model is a two-faced 44. It really puts out 35 watts of clean sound. But
explain two-faced for those who...
Two-faced is it has two personalities, and I think that one of the things I was able to do is keep enough of the classic circuitry to permit us to get a really good clean sound out to that point where the amplifier is hitting the end of its headroom. But then if you want to drive it hard and let it break up and distort like a train wreck, you can do that, and you'll get more power out, and it's much louder. But, it's not the kind of amp I've built in the past. But I just sent a friend down to Nashville who's a student down there, Mike Robinson. Mike's an excellent guitarist, and he was in the shop, and I said, here, take one of these two-face 22s down to Nashville. I just got a call the other day, and he says, a friend of mine wants to buy it. Is it okay? And he said they really love it down here because it does play really clean if you keep the gain down. And if you turn the gain up, it gets trashy.
So, Dave, can you tell us a little bit about, it's one thing to be interested in electronics. It's another thing to say, I'm going to build something that you can hear music through. That's a very special way to take electronics. What were some of the reasons that you got into that, and maybe some of your influences?
Well, as I mentioned, my father played guitar, and he played guitar very well. He could pick up classical music or popular music and play it beautifully. It was a different kind of thing than what Marc is doing today. But nevertheless, the beauty came through, and there was always music in our home. Mom and Dad both loved Dixieland, and they would play the Dixieland bands and some of the old blues bands that came out of New Orleans. And, of course, all the popular music from the 40s and the 50s. And music was always part of our lives. The experience of singing in the Glee Club at school, in high school, the experience of singing with the Columbus Menor Corps have given me an even deeper appreciation of how much music means. At the Metalcore, we have a song we sing that says, "Harmony hält uns zusammen." Harmony holds us together. And I've always thought that was a beautiful sentiment, and it's a lovely melody. And my daughter is studying philosophy. Recently got herself a degree in philosophy. And she said, "Did you know that that song that you sing is 2,500 years old?"
Oh, wow.
I said, "No." She said, "Yes, it was a translation of a philosopher from ancient Greece. It was translated in Germany and set to song. And it's 2,500 years old, that sentiment."
Wow.
And
that's cool.
I have watched through my life the influence that music has had on my family, on my friends, on my acquaintances. And music is a beautiful, wonderful thing. It's a healing thing. It's a bringing people together to experience a kind of unity they can't experience any other way. Gabby Gifford is a story. After her injury, she couldn't speak. And her therapist was working with her, and someone suggested, "Why don't you try intonation therapy?" So the therapist said, "This little light of mine," and Gabby answered, "Let it shine." Mm-hmm. That was the first time she'd spoken. 6 months later, she gave an address to Congress.
Wow.
All of her speech was stored in the music side of her brain.
That's neat.
So, we are only beginning to understand the power of music and what effect it has on our brains and where our language comes from and what brings us all together. It's the songs of the birds that keep them in a flock. You sing the wrong song, you're not in our flock.
Interesting. I didn't know that. Do you guys know that?
I've heard that.
Yep.
So you're
I've
making
seen
me
birds
so I'm the dummy
too.
here.
Yeah.
That's what you're saying.
But music is has a lot more meaning to us as humans than we can even imagine. I think that we're going to find more and more as we go forward. And to me, music has just been the most wonderful part of my life, no matter where I experience it. And that's why working with new musicians, especially the young people who hear a good tube amplifier for the first time and begin to say, "Oh, what I can do with my chords now.
Yeah.
Well, how much more beautiful can I make this?"
Yeah.
And so that's where it's at.
I'm with you, man. I think, that sentiment just about how powerful music is. You summed it up really well. I'm not going to even attempt to rehash that because I will butcher it. And Jeff's nodding at me like, "Yes, you will." I've been known to butcher it, so it's all right. But I mean, honestly, that's the whole reason that you're sitting there. I'm sitting here. Jeff's sitting there. Yep. Mark's sitting there. And anybody who's listening to this is got their ears glued to it right now, because it's an important thing, and when it gets a hold of you, it doesn't let go. We're going to wrap up this first part, I think, right now, and we're gonna get on to the second part of this in just a little bit. David, it's been really great having you here. And talking, being an honorary knob today. You don't have to tell anybody that, though. So those we will have some shots of this interview. We're going to have links to how to get in touch with Dave and get your hands on these amplifiers. We're just really blown away, and we know that anybody who's hearing this is probably going to be very interested too. So hopefully you stay pretty busy. Mark, you want to take us out on a little something?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Screw that up.